I was just about to RSVP to the dinner when my phone rang. It was my mother. Her name flashed on the screen, and as usual, I braced myself. She'd been planning this family dinner for weeks, extended relatives, old friends, even some people I hadn't seen since college. Supposedly, it was about family unity. I should have known better. I answered, "Hi, Mom." My mother said sharply and without small talk, "I wanted to catch you before you sent your RSVP." I paused. "Okay, what's going on?" She hesitated just a moment. Then my mother said, "I think it would be best if you came to the dinner alone." I blinked. "Alone?" I repeated. My mother quickly added, "Yes, just you, not James." I let the silence hang for a second. Then I said slowly, "You're telling me not to bring my husband?" She sighed, like I was being difficult. "It's not personal. I just think it might be simpler this way. The dinner is going to be very formal, and we want to keep the tone elevated." "Elevated?" I asked. "Yes," my mother said. "You know how your uncle can be. And some of the other guests are from very polished backgrounds. I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable." I could feel my hands getting cold. "James makes people uncomfortable?" My mother replied. "Darling, you know he's sweet, but he's not exactly refined. His mannerisms, his background, it's not what people expect in that setting." I said clearly, "Say what you really mean." There was a pause before my mother said, carefully, "I just don't want anyone to feel embarrassed." I repeated it back, flatly. "Embarrassed. You're afraid my husband will embarrass you." "I didn't say that," she replied quickly. "You didn't have to," I said. My mother's tone became defensive. "Look, I'm just trying to make sure the night goes smoothly. He doesn't need to be there. You understand, don't you?" "No," I said. "I really don't." She tried to make it sound like nothing. "You're always so sensitive. It's just one evening." I stayed silent. She added, "And really, if James is confident in himself, he shouldn't take it personally." I said very clearly, "You're asking me to exclude my husband from my own family dinner. Not because he's done anything wrong, but because you think he doesn't belong." "I just want what's best for everyone," she said. I replied, "No, you want what looks best to everyone." "I'm hanging up now," I added quietly. My mother said, "I hope you won't overreact." I didn't answer. I just hung up. James was in the kitchen pouring tea into mugs. When he turned around and saw me, he smiled. "Everything okay?" I sat down and said softly, "My mom doesn't want you at the dinner." James didn't flinch. "She said that?" I nodded. "She said it would be better if I went alone. She thinks you might embarrass the family." James walked over, handed me a mug, and sat beside me. "That's not even surprising." "I'm so sorry," I whispered. James said, calm as ever, "You don't have to be. I've known how she felt since the first time she looked at my shoes." I looked at him. "You never said anything." James smiled. "Because I knew who I married, and she's nothing like them." I let out a shaky breath. "What do we do?" James shrugged. "Skip it." I hesitated. "They'll turn it into another scandal." James asked, "Do you care?" "No," I said. "Not anymore." He took a sip of tea and added casually, "You know what's funny?" I glanced at him. "What?" James said, "That restaurant they're hosting the dinner at? It's one of the places I bought last month." I blinked. "You're serious?" James nodded. "Yeah, it's part of that regional chain we acquired. I didn't even realize until the contract closed last week." I stared at him. "You own the restaurant?" He smiled. "Technically, the holding group does, but yes, it's ours now." I was speechless. James leaned back, totally relaxed. I wasn't going to say anything, but now it feels poetic. I couldn't help it. I laughed. "You're telling me my mother banned you from attending a dinner at your own restaurant?" James raised an eyebrow. "That's exactly what I'm saying." I looked at him, really looked. This man, humble, brilliant, never chasing the spotlight, had just become the owner of the place my family was using to look fancy. I said slowly, we let the food do the talking. James lifted his mug in a toast. To being low class. I clinked mine against his. To rising quietly. I used to think I was imagining it. The looks, the pauses, the little corrections my mother would make every time James opened his mouth. I told myself it was generational, or just her way. But it wasn't. It was judgment, sharpened and quiet. When I first introduced James to my family, I was so proud. We were in love. I had finally found someone who made me feel seen, not for what I could offer, but for who I was. I had been so sure they'd love him. They didn't. At the first dinner, my mother smiled too wide and asked James, "So what exactly do you do again?" James, cheerful as always, said, "I run a logistics company. We handle fulfillment for small e-commerce brands." My brother Matt chuckled under his breath and said, "So, deliveries?" James just smiled and nodded. "Pretty much." I wanted to crawl under the table. Afterward, in the car, I asked James if he was upset. James said, "It's fine. I don't need their approval." That night set the tone for everything that came after. Quiet jabs, polite smirks, my mother's backhanded compliments. During Christmas, my mother handed James a gift, a plain pair of socks. Then she said, "It's practical. Figured you're always on your feet." She said it sweetly, but her eyes were sharp. One time, James mispronounced charcuterie at a brunch. My mother repeated it slowly, correcting him like he was a misbehaving schoolboy. James only chuckled and said, "I'm not fancy, but I know good food." My mother replied, "Knowing how to pronounce the food is part of enjoying it." I wanted to disappear. On our second anniversary, we hosted a dinner. James made everything himself: braised short ribs, fresh-baked bread, wine pairings he researched for days. My mother walked in, sniffed, and said, "Smells rustic." Later, my sister Alicia whispered to me, "Mom just doesn't want you to settle." I said, "I'm not settling." Alicia gave that smug shrug and said, "He's sweet, but come on, he's not really on your level." I asked, "What level is that exactly?" Alicia laughed. "Well, he's not exactly Dad, is he?" She meant our father, the man who spent most of his life chasing investments that failed, hosting empty dinner parties, and bragging about connections that never turned into anything. He wore tailored suits and gave off the illusion of success. James didn't do illusions, but they didn't want real. They wanted polish. What they didn't see, or refused to, was everything James had built. They didn't know he was the one who paid off my student loans the day we got married. He handed me an envelope. No drama. "Just wanted you to start fresh," James said. "No baggage." They didn't know he bought my favorite bookstore to save it from closing because he knew how much it meant to me. They didn't know how many people he had quietly employed: former warehouse guys, out-of-work drivers, single parents who just needed a chance. James never advertised his success. He didn't talk about his portfolio or boast about deals. But he had more integrity in his silence than most people have in a lifetime of speeches. When I had emergency surgery for an ovarian cyst last year, James stayed by my side for 4 straight nights in a hospital chair. He asked the nurses questions. He kept a notebook of my vitals. He read to me when I was too tired to watch TV. My mother came once. For 15 minutes. She brought me a hand cream and said, "Well, this is why I told you not to stress so much." Alicia didn't come at all. She texted me, "Hospitals make me uncomfortable. Hope you're okay." James didn't leave the room. And still, they didn't think he was good enough. One Thanksgiving, after a full day of hosting, James cooking, plating, doing everything, my father raised his glass and said, "To our daughters and their families, Alicia's husband just made partner. We're so proud." Nothing about James. Nothing about me. After everyone left, I stood in the kitchen scraping plates. James walked over and asked, "You okay?" I nodded and said, "Just tired." He touched my shoulder and said gently, You deserve to be seen. He always said that. And he always meant it. That's what made the dinner exclusion so different. This wasn't just a snide remark. It wasn't a comment I could brush off. This was a line. The morning after my mother's call, I sat outside in our backyard. Coffee in my hands, the sun not quite up. James was watering the garden, humming to himself. Calm, steady, mine. I thought about everything we'd built, every dollar saved, every risk taken, every time we chose each other, even when it was hard. He had gone from driving a delivery van to managing entire supply chains. And now, after years of building quietly, he owned a holding company that had just acquired several regional restaurants, including the very one where my family was planning their fancy, elevated dinner. When James told me, it wasn't smug. He said it casually, while folding laundry. James said, "Yeah, it's one of ours now. Funny, huh?" I blinked and said, "You're serious?" He nodded. "It was part of that deal last month. I didn't think it mattered." I stared at him. "You own the restaurant?" James replied. "Technically the holding group does, but yeah, it's ours." I almost laughed. He grinned and added, "Want me to cancel their reservation?" I shook my head. "No, let them go." James looked surprised. "You sure?" I said. "I want them to enjoy it." He asked, "Even after what she said?" I said, "Especially after what she said." James raised an eyebrow. "You're playing the long game." I smiled. "Always." Later that week, I sat across from him and asked, "How did you know they'd never accept you?" James looked at me calmly and said, "Because they never tried to understand me. And people who won't see you for who you are don't want acceptance. They want control." I asked, "And you still married me?" James smiled. "Because you're not them." I thought back to our first date. He showed up with a bouquet of sunflowers. I asked if he knew they were my favorite. James said, "No, they just looked happy. I figured you deserved something happy." I remembered when he built a bookshelf in our first apartment. I hadn't even asked. I just mentioned wanting one. He stayed up until 3 a.m., sanding and painting it. James told me, "You should come home to something that makes you smile." That's who he was. Thoughtful, humble, steady. So when my mother told me not to bring him to dinner, she wasn't just insulting him. She was insulting the life I'd chosen, the happiness I'd built. But she couldn't unbuild it. I went inside and opened the drawer where James kept our business paperwork. The acquisition papers were right there, labeled clearly. And there it was, the name of the restaurant in bold font. It felt like fate. James came in and saw me holding the folder. He grinned and said, "Planning a coup?" I laughed and said, "Something like that." He asked, "So, we skipping the dinner?" I said, "No, we're going to let them eat." He said, "Let them eat?" I replied, "Yes, at our table, on our terms." He stepped closer and said, "We don't have to prove anything." I nodded. "This isn't about proving. It's about remembering." He smiled and said, "Then let's do it your way." And so we did. James didn't make a single call. He didn't need to. The restaurant group had recently finalized the acquisition, and the general manager of the flagship location already knew who James was. One short email and a forwarded reservation code was all it took to switch the booking to owner-hosted. I watched him type it from across the living room. Calm, casual, efficient. James said, "They won't know until they show up." I nodded. That's the idea. The reservation was under my parents' name, set for 7:30 p.m. that Saturday. 24 people. Aunts, uncles, cousins. An elegant family reunion at one of the city's trendiest new spots. Except the entire space had recently become part of a portfolio James now controlled. I called the restaurant to add one more instruction. I said, "Please inform the host that Mr. Whitaker and I will arrive 5 minutes after the rest of the party is seated." The woman on the phone responded, "Of course. Will Mr. Whitaker be dining with them?" I smiled and said, "Yes, he's the owner." When Saturday arrived, James ironed his charcoal gray jacket with quiet precision. I slipped into a fitted black dress, simple, elegant. For once, I wasn't anxious. As we got into the car, James glanced at me and said, "We don't have to do this." I replied, "We're not doing it to hurt them." He nodded. "I know," I added. "We're just done hiding." He reached for my hand and said, "Then let's go." At 7:35 p.m., we pulled into the reserved parking area behind the restaurant. The valets knew who we were. One of them opened my door with a warm, "Mrs. Whitaker, it's a pleasure." Inside, the private dining room buzzed with energy. I could hear the voices before we even stepped in. The clinking of glasses, polite laughter, small talk. All the things they used to do without us. A young hostess greeted us at the door with a glowing smile. She said, "Welcome. The Whitaker party is already seated. The manager will be bringing out a toast in just a moment." We nodded and followed her into the room. The moment we stepped in, silence spread like ink in water. My mother's smile froze. My father put down his wine glass slowly. My sister Alicia blinked at James, then looked at me. James smiled and greeted the room. "Evening, everyone." My Uncle Greg stood up to shake his hand. "Well, look who decided to show up." James returned the handshake. "Wouldn't miss it." The manager entered moments later, holding a small card in his hand. He said, "On behalf of the restaurant group, we'd like to thank the new ownership team. Mr. Whitaker, your presence tonight is an honor. We're proud to have you here." Gasps. Audible. My mother finally spoke, voice brittle. "Wait, you're the new owner?" James looked directly at her and said, "One of them, yes." My father stared at his glass. Alicia shifted in her seat. You could hear a pin drop. I sat down beside James and folded my napkin across my lap. Then I said, "Mom, this is the man you said would embarrass you." James leaned forward slightly and said, "Don't worry, I promise not to." Nobody knew what to say. The servers brought out the wine, the food. The night continued, but the tone had shifted entirely. James was gracious, warm, unbothered. He didn't gloat, he didn't lecture. He let the space speak for him, and it did. At one point, my cousin Daniel leaned across the table and asked, "So wait, James really owns this place?" Before I could answer, James spoke with a modest nod. "It's part of a larger group. We've been working on expanding in this region." Daniel let out a low whistle. "Man, I had no idea." James smiled. "Most people don't. That's okay." The servers began delivering course after course: filet with garlic shallot butter, roasted beet salad, handmade gnocchi. Everything tasted better, sharper, more satisfying. Across the table, my mother wasn't touching her food. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water. I watched her avoid James's gaze, saw the way she tried to reorient herself in a world she no longer controlled. Eventually, she looked up at me and asked, "So why didn't you say anything?" I kept my voice calm. "Because you never asked." My father cleared his throat. "You could have said something. This is unexpected," I responded without flinching. "What's unexpected is being told my husband wasn't good enough to sit at this table, and then finding out it was his table all along." No one replied. The servers brought dessert, a lemon tart topped with sugared blueberries, James's favorite. I had asked for it to be added. My aunt tried to shift the mood, saying, "Well, what a lovely coincidence this all is." I turned to her and said, "It's not a coincidence. It's the first time you're seeing what's always been there." James placed his hand lightly on mine. His touch grounded me, reminded me this wasn't about making them feel small. It was about us no longer feeling invisible. Later, the manager returned with a final flourish. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, thank you again. The team is honored to serve your family tonight." My mother opened her mouth to say something, but then closed it again. The words didn't come. After dinner, as everyone lingered, James shook hands, said polite goodbyes. People tried to make small talk. My father clapped him on the back and said, "Impressive, son." James simply said, "Thank you." Alicia approached me at the door. She said, "I didn't know about any of it." I answered plainly. That's because none of you ever cared to ask. She looked away. It's just, this changes things. I raised an eyebrow. Does it? Or does it just make you uncomfortable? She didn't answer. As we stepped into the night air, James let out a quiet breath. Well, that was something, I said. Did it feel like a win? James shook his head. It just felt necessary. I nodded. Yeah, it did. We drove home in silence, a peaceful silence. No need to rehash it, no need to dissect it. The point had landed, softly and completely. They saw us now, whether they liked it or not, and we didn't need their permission anymore. Back at home that night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window. James came over, resting a hand on my shoulder. You all right? I said. I thought I'd feel more vindicated. He nodded slowly. And instead, I sighed. I feel free. I looked out at the quiet street. For so long, I thought if I just worked harder, showed up more, they'd see me, that they'd see us. James said, they saw what they wanted to see. And now? I asked. James replied, now they have no choice but to see the truth. We sat in silence for a while. Then I turned to him and said, you handled tonight with so much grace. I'm proud of you. He smiled. I'm proud of us. I leaned into his chest and closed my eyes. In that moment, I realized something important. This dinner wasn't our climax. It wasn't revenge, it was closure. They didn't need to apologize for me to move forward, because their respect was never the prize. Peace was. And finally, I had it. The morning after the dinner, I didn't check my phone. I made pancakes. James played old jazz records. We sipped our coffee like it was any other Sunday. Around 10 a.m., my phone buzzed with the first message. It was from Alicia. She wrote, last night really opened my eyes. Maybe we could catch up sometime? I showed the message to James. He asked, do you want to? I shook my head. Not yet, maybe not ever. By noon, I had 3 more messages, from my aunt, my cousin, and then finally, my mother. My mother's message was short. I didn't know. I'm sorry if I hurt you. Not. I'm sorry I said your husband would embarrass us. Just, if. That was the difference. The kind of apology that asks for comfort, not accountability. I didn't respond. For years, I had been trained to manage their feelings, to forgive in advance, to offer understanding before they even asked. But after that dinner, something had shifted inside me. James noticed it too. He said, you're standing taller today. I smiled. I feel lighter. Calls started coming later that week. A few relatives told me how proud they were of us. One uncle said, you really surprised everyone. But the tone wasn't admiration. It was shock. The kind that only exists when someone has never bothered to look beneath the surface. I told James, it's not that they suddenly respect us, they just don't know how to talk to us anymore. He nodded, because the story they had in their heads doesn't work anymore. He was right. Their version of me, the quiet daughter, the woman with the unimpressive husband, was gone. And without that script, they were lost. Later that week, Alicia called while I was making dinner. I let it ring twice before answering. Alicia said, hey, I've been thinking about everything. That dinner was... wow. I kept my voice neutral. Yes, it was. She hesitated. I guess I didn't really realize how much you two had built. I said, you never asked. A pause. Then she added, well, it made me feel like I should do better. You know, be closer. I stirred the soup and replied, I'm not interested in proximity that only happens after status changes. Alicia's voice faltered. That's a little harsh. I said, maybe, but it's honest. She didn't know what to say. I told her I had to go and hung up before she could make it about herself. My father called the next day. That was rare. He said, I owe you an apology. I asked, for what? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, for letting your mother speak for both of us, for not seeing the full picture. I didn't rush to forgive. I let the silence linger. Eventually, I said, "Thank you for saying that." Then he asked, "Are we okay?" I said, "We're better than we were, but that doesn't mean everything goes back to how it was." He said, "I understand." But I don't think he did. Because what had changed wasn't just how they saw us, it was how I saw them. For years, I saw them as the bar I had to clear, the people whose approval would finally mean I'd made it. But now I saw the truth. They weren't the standard. They were just the echo of a value system I never actually believed in. The following weekend, we went to a friend's cabin in the mountains, just James and me, no phones, no messages. I left my notifications off. We hiked, we cooked together. We sat by the fire and didn't talk about my family at all. It was the most peace I'd felt in months. When we returned, I saw that my mother had left a voicemail. Her voice was stiff. "I don't appreciate being shut out. Your sister and I are both trying to reach out and you're being incredibly cold." Then, she added, "You used to be better than this." I stared at the phone and whispered, "No, I used to be quieter than this." James asked, "Do you want to call her back?" I shook my head. "No, I think I've said everything I needed to say by saying nothing." That realization, that silence could be powerful, felt like stepping into a new skin. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. I was just done. I started reclaiming little parts of myself. I donated the pearls my mother gave me years ago and never let me forget. I stopped sending holiday invitations. I quit trying to mediate family drama. And something amazing happened. I had more time, more mental space, more joy. My friend Maribel noticed. Over brunch, she said, "You look like you're breathing easier." I smiled and said, "I stopped making room for people who don't make room for me." She raised her glass. "That's freedom." It was. I wasn't shutting my family out to punish them. I was letting go of a pattern that had always left me bruised. They wanted access, not relationship. And once the access was gone, they didn't know who I was without it. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I found an old photo, me at 15, standing behind my mother and sister at a recital. I was barely in the frame. I stared at it for a long time, not with sadness, with clarity. That girl used to think love was something you earned by staying small. I held the photo up to the light and said aloud, "You don't owe anyone your silence." James walked in and caught the tail end of my whisper. He asked, "Talking to old ghosts?" I smiled, telling them I'm not who they remember. That night, we sat out on the porch as the sun dipped below the skyline. James asked, "Do you think they'll ever change?" I said, "Maybe, but they'll have to do it without me holding the mirror." He nodded and said, "That's fair." The next day, I wrote one final message. I sent it only to my mother and sister. I wrote, "I'm no longer available for a version of this family that requires me to disappear in order for you to feel comfortable. I wish you both growth and peace." Then I blocked their numbers, not from anger, but from resolution. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't managing anyone else's story. I was living mine. And that story didn't need their approval. It needed truth. It needed joy. It needed space. And now, finally, I had all three. Spring arrived slowly that year, the kind of gradual bloom that mirrored the shift inside me. The weight I'd carried for so long, trying to be good enough, acceptable enough, quiet enough, had finally fallen away. Not all at once, but piece by piece. James noticed it before I did. One morning, while we were walking the dog through the neighborhood, he turned to me and said, "You've been smiling in your sleep." I laughed. "Really?" He nodded. "Like you're finally dreaming for yourself." We walked in silence for a bit, the sun just beginning to peek through the trees. Then I said, "I feel like I'm not performing anymore, like I'm not waiting for someone to hand me permission." He squeezed my hand. "That's because you never needed it." In the months after the dinner, the messages from my family slowed, first weekly, then monthly. Then not at all. It didn't hurt like I thought it would, because I wasn't angry anymore. I had spent years trying to win love from people who only understood control. But now, love looked like something different. It looked like safety, laughter, being fully seen. It looked like James, dancing barefoot in our kitchen to an old Stevie Wonder song, holding a wooden spoon like a microphone and singing wildly off-key just to make me laugh. And I laughed, harder than I had in years. One weekend in June, we hosted a small dinner party. Just close friends, the kind who knew our story not because they'd pried, but because they'd stayed long enough to earn it. Maribel arrived with a bouquet of sunflowers, her husband trailing behind her with a bottle of wine. Our neighbors brought homemade tiramisu. We grilled out back under string lights, with music playing low and warm across the yard. At one point, someone raised a toast to choosing the people who choose you. I caught James's eye from across the table and felt tears sting the corners of my vision, not from sadness, from gratitude. Later that night, as we cleaned up together, James turned to me and said, "Do you ever miss them?" He didn't have to say who. I paused before answering. I miss the idea of what they could have been, but not who they really were. James nodded. That's fair. I said, they taught me a lot in their own way. James asked, like what? I set down a stack of plates and replied, that love with conditions isn't love. That I don't need to earn dignity by being quiet. And that you can't heal in a place that keeps reopening the wound. He pulled me into a hug, held me close. We stood there, in the middle of our kitchen, surrounded by crumbs and wine glasses and warmth. No spotlight, no applause. Just the quiet satisfaction of being whole. That summer, I started volunteering at a local women's mentorship program. Once a week, I sat across from young women at folding tables and listened to them talk about fear, ambition, rejection, and family. One evening, a 22-year-old with tired eyes told me, "My mom says I'm selfish for not helping her pay her rent." I asked her, "Are you the only one she asks?" She looked down at the table and nodded. I didn't offer a cliché. I just said, "That's not love, that's access." Her eyes filled with tears. I knew that look. I had worn it for most of my life. When I got home that night, James was already making dinner. I sat on the counter and told him the story. He said, "You're good at this." I asked, "Good at what?" He replied, "Taking what broke you and turning it into something useful." I didn't answer right away. I just smiled, softly, gratefully. A week later, I was asked to speak at a community luncheon. Nothing big, just a few dozen people and a microphone. I talked about boundaries, about choosing peace, about how sometimes the family we build is stronger than the family we're born into. Afterward, a woman approached me with wet eyes and said, "I thought I was the only one." I told her, "You never were." That night, I realized something important. I didn't just survive what they did to me, I transformed it. In late August, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. It was from my mother. The note was short. It read, "I still don't understand what I did that was so wrong, but I hope you're well." No apology, just confusion wrapped in guilt. I showed it to James. He asked, "Do you want to respond?" I stared at the letter and said, "No, I want to release it." I walked outside, tore the note in half, and dropped it into the recycling bin. Not with anger, just with finality. Because I had finally accepted that not everyone would understand your healing, and they didn't have to. Later that month, James and I went away to celebrate our anniversary. A quiet coastal town, long walks, lazy afternoons with books and coffee. The kind of peace I once thought was reserved for other people. One evening, we sat on a bench overlooking the waves. The sky was streaked with amber and lavender. James said, "If you could go back and change it all, would you?" I didn't need to think. I said, "No, because then I might not have ended up here." He smiled. "With me?" I nodded. "With you. With myself. with this life we built. We sat in silence as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. And for the first time in my life, I didn't wish for a different past. I was simply grateful for the present, and completely, deeply ready for whatever came next. Months passed, then a year, then two. Birthdays came and went, holidays too, and for the first time, I didn't dread them. I filled those days with laughter, good food, slow mornings, and people who made me feel seen without having to prove anything. I never received another letter, no more voicemails. The silence became its own kind of grace. Sometimes, old memories still flickered through, a comment, a cold glance, a feeling I couldn't quite name, but they no longer held power. They were just ghosts passing through a well-lit room. I found a kind of joy I didn't know existed, one rooted not in approval, but in alignment. I wasn't perfect. I wasn't always confident. But I was real. And that was enough. One rainy afternoon, I stood in the doorway of my home, watching James come in from the storm with our groceries tucked under his coat. He shook the water from his hair and grinned like a fool. And I thought, this is the life I fought for. Not a perfect one. Not a performative one. But mine. The girl who used to sit at family dinners, desperate to be seen, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned, painfully, quietly, beautifully, that her worth was never up for debate. She didn't win her family back, she won herself. And that was everything.